Hello, my name is Olurotimi. I like talking about American history and world history. Today is an important day in world history. It's March the 15th, 2026. It is uh, the anniversary, the 2070th anniversary of the Ides of March when Julius Caesar was assassinated by senators after they stabbed him 23 times. Um, so Julius Caesar was one great general, or a great Italian general. I want to talk today about another general who was Italian. He was Italian as well. Napoleon Bonaparte. Many people don't realize that Napoleon was actually of Italian heritage. So Napoleon was an Italian from the born on the island of Corsica. He actually became the reason he became French was because the year before his birth, that Italian island of Corsica was colonized by the French. It was colonized by it was occupied and seized by the French, so it became part of the French Empire, and so that's how Napoleon got to be French. You never believe throughout his life, his first language was Italian. So throughout his life, he spoke with an Italian accent. He spoke for his French with an accent, and so he was always mocked in school. So he was able to go into the most prestigious French military academy. Napoleon was brilliant. He was a brilliant mathematician. He was a genius. Historians consider he had genius IQ. He was a brilliant mathematician, and he loved strategy. He loved chess. He was a workaholic, and of course, he became a general at the age of 24, which was, of course, very unusual. He got his opportunity due to the French Revolution. Um, However, what I want to talk about, though, about Napoleon is his doomed invasion of Russia, which was the beginning of his end, right? In 1812, Napoleon took 600,000 soldiers to invade Russia. Of course, Napoleon loved wars. He fought wars all the time, and he conquered everybody. He was a brilliant strategist. I did military history when I was in school, and Napoleon is considered one of the most brilliant generals of all time. Right, military schools like to study Napoleon, but his invasion of Russia was what destroyed him. Now, later on, I'm going to draw parallels. I'm going to be able to show some parallels with uh, America's intended invasion of Iran, right? Iran is a region that has, the terrain is very mountainous, and Iranians are over 90 million people, right? And in the 70s, they had the fifth strongest military in the world. By the time on the eve of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, um, I'm not going to overwhelm this discussion because what I want to do is talk a little bit more about how the Russian invasion turned out to be a Pyrrhic victory for Napoleon. But we'll be able to see parallels. And one of the advantages of history is that, you can find parallels in history and you can use it, you can apply it. You find patterns in history and you can apply it to analyze your present and predict the future. Sometimes, you can do it pretty accurately. And you will find that from my discussion of the ill-fated French invasion of Russia in 1812, which eventually led to the uh, destruction of and the eventual fall of Napoleon and the French Empire. We'll be able to find parallels in America's attempted invasion of of Iran, right? Iranians are waiting, but that's their home turf. There's just some advantages people have if you go onto their home turf, especially people who have a certain zeitgeist, a certain raison d'etre, a certain psychology. Um, Iranians have been waiting, and so it doesn't matter that America has the strongest military force in the world right now. That was the same thing with Napoleon Bonaparte. He had the strongest military in the world at that time. In fact, one of the reasons why America uh, jumped at the Louisiana Purchase was because our leaders, the founding fathers, were constantly afraid Napoleon would have entertained uh, ambitions to conquer North America, and so they wanted to forestall that. So they were very scared of Napoleon. Everybody was scared of Napoleon, right? And but what caused Napoleon to unravel was the his war, his invasion of Russia. From Napoleon, from that war, you learn it's not every battle, it's not every war that the most powerful being, the most powerful army should engage in, because there's just some wars that will end up being Pyrrhic victories. Because the most powerful force, right, starts to entertain hubris, right, and hubris is the beginning uh, of one's unraveling. It's so funny. Today's Sunday, and so the Bible says it and puts it in this way that he who exalts himself will be humiliated, and pride goes before a fall, before destruction. Pride, so hubris, right? You have to be very careful. If you're powerful, if you have stuff, you've got to try and remain humble, right? And not let pride sink in, because it's just a principle in life. But in any event, let me get back into the story of Napoleon's ill-fated invasion of Russia. Now, it's funny, I got to read War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, and the way Leo Tolstoy describes it is very interesting. I've read several biographies of Napoleon Bonaparte, and they all describe uh, the invasion of Russia. But reading War and Peace, Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, it's often described as arguably the world's greatest novel, right? Um, it's a huge book, over 1,200 pages. It's a huge book, but he takes a lot of time. It's a bit of historical fiction, right? Because in the war against he describes the French invasion of Russia. And he's talking; these are real characters, but he was also describing the psychology and the mindset of the Russian people. He kept focusing on it, and he was showing how Napoleon was so arrogant. That he was so arrogant. He was this great man. Everything had gone his way, and he thought he would just come and conquer the Russians. He didn't understand the psychology of the Russians, and this was something he kept doing. Right? He kept talking about. He kept focusing on the psychology. In fact, it was almost exhausting to hear, to read Tolstoy keep describing the psychology of the Russians, and Napoleon didn't understand the psychology of the Russians, and he kept focusing, emphasizing the psychology of the Russians, and they wouldn't give up. They were determined. It didn't matter that Napoleon saw himself as a great man and that history was written for him. But the Russians, you couldn't dominate them. You couldn't conquer them. This was something Leo Tolstoy kept writing about. So, what happened? This is actually an example of a Pyrrhic victory. I've done a video describing what a Pyrrhic victory is, right? When the king, Pyrrhus was the king of Epirus, went and fought the Romans, he defeated them, right? He defeated them at two battles. One was Heraclea uh, and Asculum. He defeated them at the two battles, trying to uh, help help the Italians, right? The colony they had. Um, but after defeating the Romans, they praised him, they congratulated him. He said, "Well, one more victory like this over the Romans, right?" and it will be our utter ruin. We'll be utterly ruined, right? And which happened eventually. So this is an example of a Pyrrhic victory. So Napoleon starts to invade. The first uh, Russian general that commanded the army was his name was Michael Andreas Barclays de Tully, right? Michael Andreas Barclay de Tully. This was in June, from June to August 1812. His method was to use the scorched earth policy. Scorched earth, right? Napoleon had come with 600,000 military. So this was, they came around summer. But instead of confronting Napoleon's army, he kept retreating and he was using the scorched earth policy, right? He would appear to engage with them in a skirmish, and he just kept running. He kept retreating, and he would burn the lands. Scorched earth is when you an army destroys all the food, the resources of the land to make sure that the enemy does not have food to eat. They don't have resources. They don't have supplies. So this was what the Russians were doing. That under uh, Barclay de Tully. It was using employing the scorched earth, and it just kept on running and running and running. But this sort of frustrated uh, the Tsar of Russia, Alexander the First, and so that this guy didn't want to fight because he just kept running further inside into Russia. Now, the Russian terrain is very treacherous, right? And Iranians, by the way, are neighbors of the Russians, and so they have uh, very similar, the steppes and uh, their neighbors, right? So apparently, he was planning to lure Napoleon's forces into the Russian winter. So he kept running, but the Emperor of Russia, Alexander the First, decides to replace Barclay de Tolly, and Napoleon kept pursuing with his 600,000 soldiers. He kept pursuing, going deep, deep, deep into Russia. Eventually, Field Marshal uh, Mikhail Kutuzov then comes. He was a very old man, very old. They mocked him. He was close to retirement. He was a very old man, and he eventually confronted Napoleon on September the 7th, 1812, and they fought at the Battle of Borodino, right? They fought Napoleon with his huge army. They fought tactically. Napoleon won. Napoleon defeated them, right? Napoleon defeated them, but there were devastating losses. They lost about 80,000 soldiers. It was the bloodiest, deadliest battle of all the Napoleonic wars. Napoleon had been fighting wars since the 18th century, right? End of the 18th century. Into 12 wars, he was fighting everybody. He had conquered everybody, and they make treaties. He'd conquer everybody. He couldn't get tired. He always wanted more, right? And so this was the bloodiest battle, 80,000. And Napoleon was a tactical genius. He won the battle. He defeated Kutuzov, right? But it wasn't a decisive victory because rather than surrender, all the forces of Field Marshal Kutuzov uh, went destroyed, right? His army remained intact. He lost that battle. Instead of surrendering, though, he decided to retreat. He withdrew, and he retreated. He withdrew, and he kept going inside. After they fought that battle near Moscow, but something he did as he withdrew, the governor of Moscow and the Russian soldiers, they decided to do something crazy. Moscow was their capital, right? They decided to burn Moscow down, right? They continue the scorched earth policy, destroying all the food. So, a people that's indigenous to a terrain, they know how to get food resources. They know what to do. They know how to get resources, food, right? The invading army, they're limited by logistics. Invading army typically, they just get enough supplies and they intend that, well, once they defeat you, they will live off the land of the people they've conquered. Uh, and that was what the French did. The French anticipated that, well, once they defeat the Russians, they'll surrender and they'll have, they'll be able to take over the resources, live off the resources of the land, the supplies. But the Russians kept using the scorched earth policy. They kept burning everything, destroying all the food, burning everything, all the livestock, burned everything. And that was what they did after Napoleon defeated them at the Battle of Borodino. They burned down Russia. Two-thirds of Russia burned down and they retreated. They just went further in. So Napoleon entered, he thought he was victorious. The way Leo Tolstoy describes it, it's so funny. Leo Tolstoy was the psycho because it was so War and Peace is also like a psych. It's considered to be not just a novel, but also a book of philosophy and a book on psychology because he was writing deeply about the psychology of Napoleon. He would go into Napoleon's mind, how Napoleon felt. That Napoleon felt victorious once he'd won at the battle of defeated the Russians at the Battle of Borodino. He thought he was waiting for their surrender, that they would come and surrender to him. He was waiting, right, because he'd won them. And so he decides that, okay, that maybe they're shy. He was thinking all sorts of stuff, but he was showing you what sort of megalomania Napoleon really was, right? Historians have said Napoleon was indeed a megalomaniac. Napoleon, when he made himself emperor, the convention was for the Pope to crown you, but he decided to put the crown on his own head, right? He was a megalomaniac. Um, so when he made himself emperor of the French, so Napoleon goes into Moscow and he was stunned, right? And Tolstoy is writing. He's writing and he's describing the thinking, the psychology of Napoleon. His thoughts that okay, that he's assuming he was waiting for them initially, but nobody came. They didn't surrender. They didn't send anybody. So he decides, okay, maybe they're shy. And he's going to go into um, Moscow and march in triumphantly. And he was surprised that once he entered Moscow, it was empty. It was not just empty, then there was a fire was burning down. He was shocked that these people are crazy. How can they burn their own city, their best city? Why is they burning it down? Like, what kind of people are these? They burned down Moscow. They withdrew. So Russia has the largest landmass in the world, right? It has the largest landmass in the world, and so you just keep going deep, 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 deep into Russia. So they were going deeper, deeper into the heartland, and that was what they did. They had deceived the French to come deep inside Russia, so they had no food. What happened was that Napoleon, who'd entered Russia with 600,000 men, because there was no food, and they were now stuck in Russia's winter. Russia's wicked, uh, distressing, destructive winter, right? Fierce winter. The French were in a foreign land in Russia, the coldest place in the world, amongst one of maybe definitely the coldest place those French soldiers had ever been in, and they had no food. What happened was the victorious French soldiers who had just defeated the Russians in their own land, but the Russians refused to surrender. They ended up eating their horses. There was cannibalism. They started eating boots, leather. They died. French soldiers died of starvation. The Russians didn't have to fight them in battle. They ended up dying of starvation. Go and read that battle, that fight, that war. They were stuck in a massive land because Russia was massive land, right? Huge terrain, lots of land, and they went deep inside to go and fight the Russians. They didn't know the Russians had been, they'd been, they dug a trap. They planned a snare for them, planning to ensnare them. They had no food. They were in the middle of Russia in winter. Napoleon had gone into Russia with 600,000 soldiers. He fled. He ended up withdrawing in October 2012. He withdrew from um, Russia in humiliation with just 30,000 men. You can imagine he went in with 600,000 men. He won the Battle of Borodino, but the Russians just used scorched earth policy and they just withdrew deeper into Russia, into the cold. And Napoleon, they died of starvation and disease and the cold. They froze to death. And Napoleon left, humiliated, with just 30,000 men. So he talk about winning the battle and losing the war. So that was the beginning of the end of for Napoleon. People normally talk about his defeat at Waterloo, but the loss of his army, a 600,000 sized army, was what it basically stripped him, divested him of all his energy, divested the French army, the Grande Armee of the French, of their energy, their strength. So the rest of Europe knew. So all the alliances he'd built with all the European powers that he had defeated, they ended up siding with the British. Something you learn about European powers, I mean, geopolitics, is there are no permanent allies, there are no permanent enemies, right? America and Russia, their enemy, the USSR, once became allies. They were allies in the Second World War. In fact, America, USSR, China, they were allies. And Britain, they were allies. America had gone to war with Britain several times, right? During 1776, during 1812, they'd gone to war, but they patched things up to fight Germany. So major powers know there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, no permanent allies, no permanent enemies, right? They will re-strategize, realign to defeat a common enemy that's too strong. Napoleon, the French were were the common enemy of the French, and they were the common enemy of the Germans, the Austrians, all the people that had been fighting the British, um, and they all aligned. And Napoleon and his army, they were just like a straw man by this time, right? They didn't have their real source, their real energy anymore. And it was like, so the Waterloo battle, right, was just like hitting a paper tiger or a straw man. Very easy. You just need to even blow huge puff and they fall down. So that was why Napoleon crumbled so easily at Waterloo. But it was what really unraveled Napoleon and the French army was the disastrous invasion of Russia. He won the battle, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. He lost the war. He left Russia with just 30,000 men. So, and Leo Tolstoy did a very good job, just describing that war, and Napoleon's unfortunate retreat. You know, yeah, that was a huge, disastrous campaign, and that's an example of a Pyrrhic victory. So, my name is Oloroti Moshe, and I'll continue to discuss American presidents, and of course, history and international human rights law. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.